Did great contemporary saints like Elder Ephraim or Father Seraphim Rose struggle with pride? If not, how were they able to avoid this pride? What can we do when we struggle with jealousy or of the glorification that they achieved? All right, thank you very much for your donation and your question. Look, on one level, every human being struggles with pride, obviously, right? Pride being what? I mean, there's many things we can say about pride, but one thing that I want to help, I think it helps me to understand pride, is that, so pride and humility, what's the major difference between the two? The one who's animated by pride and the one who's animated by humility. The one who's proud, first of all, he has self-trust, self-love, doesn't submit himself and trust Christ, the saints, the church, right? Or a lot. Maybe he makes lip service. Maybe he's like a Pharisee, but he doesn't really submit and humble himself and say, I don't know, right? So he's assuming he's an egotist, and so that's the extreme example, right? But he lives in a fake existence, right? Does not live in reality. Why do I say that? Because he's blind to his own self. He doesn't have self-knowledge. And therefore he doesn't have, and often does not have, knowledge of God. Now he can have knowledge about God. That's different than knowledge of God. And when we say knowledge of God, we mean experiential knowledge of communion with God. Now, there's many, many proud people, even in the church, who know all about God, right? Historical events, theology, blah, 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 blah. But that's different than knowing God personally and having experiential experience of communion with God. And that happens when we're submissive to Christ in our spiritual Father, when we fast, pray, all the regiment of the spiritual life. So the proud man lives in a kind of delusion, in a cloud. He walks through this life thinking about life and himself and God, and these things are not accurate. Whereas the humble person, he lives in the truth. He sees more clearly every day the truth of things. In other words, he acquires discernment of spirits. And it's because he does not trust himself, but submits himself and trusts God in the saints and in his spiritual Father and in the scriptures and all the rest, right? All that which is given to us. He follows closely, and he does not trust himself, but he follows closely the teachings that are handed down to us. And so through that process of submission, trust, he is purified, and then he's illumined, and he becomes somebody who is thinking the thoughts of God, listening to God in his conscience, hearing his conscience and obeying it, right? So you're asking me, did they have pride? Well, I have no idea what their inner life was like initially. Obviously, Father Seraphim Rose is a little easier to determine because we know he had a life before Christ, right? Outside of the church, in which he was in delusion and he was in sin. So yeah, you can see clearly he came out of that. And the great thing about saints like Father Seraphim is the great transformation. That's what's so amazing and beautiful. And so there's no need to, hide their earlier part of the life. Nobody says, St. Mary of Egypt didn't really do what she did. No, she did it. She did a lot of it, and probably more than we even know, because it wasn't mentioned. Like, it's so gross, right? So doesn't take away, and actually adds to her greatness, because she went from that to walking on water. Obviously, that's amazing, right? That's tremendous. And so you can glorify God. So but why would you be envious of that in the sense of, like, in a sick way? It should inspire you and give you complete trust in God, that if he can do that, living a life of the flesh and a sub flesh, in other words, below even normal relations, right? He went from that, he fell into those terrible temptations and sins, to dispassionate ascetic with great illumination as to many things in the church history, church theology, and all the rest. He was illumined, and he was taught by God. So, and he was submissive to the church, and he was humble, and all the rest. So those things are beautiful. Like, that should encourage you tremendously, that to imitate him and believe that God can make you, from the sinner that you are, into a humble, holy, and lover of God. I think that's extremely encouraging for us. And why do we put him forward? Why do we put Elder Ephraim forward? Why do we put Father Seraphim Rose forward? to imitate them. That's why we do it. That's why we talk about them. It's all about following them in their life and teachings. And so it's a beautiful thing.